I'm up here from New Orleans, Louisiana, and I'm chairman of an engineering company formed in 1945, which is based in Louisiana and Texas. A couple of things. I believe Mr. Geisbuehler said the BBGA report is going to be available. Is it on this same website or is it on the DMNE website?
You refer to the slides?
Yes.
I don't know how that's...
We'll provide it on the DMNE website that was provided in the slide.
Okay, so the VA Offshore Wind is not going to supplant DMNE. It's going to be in addition to...
In addition to.
Okay, okay. Well, for those of you who are here, I'd like to know how many are familiar with Engineering News Record, which is a magazine that does a scorecard, if you will, once a year for what they call the top 500 firms. And just from a standpoint of where we are in 2018, these just came out. Our firm was number 317 in the top 500. But for today's topic, we were number 3 in what their subcategory was, the design firms in offshore and underwater facilities. So I guess that's a way to describe where I'm coming from. We do have a strong background working with oil and gas industry, not only in the Gulf of Mexico, onshore, the U.S., but offshore in other locations around the world. 2 years ago, I was at NAG's Head when there was an open meeting to discuss North Carolina's plans for offshore wind. And I was there participating in the audience. Also in the audience were the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, some other environmental interests. And at the end of a similar session like this, I spoke with some of those representatives and said, it seems like the environmental community likes what is being said here in North Carolina. And it was an interesting comment. He said, yes, we feel like as long as these wind farms are over the horizon, so they're not seen from the beach, it's clean energy, it's renewable, and I can speak to some of the questions about how consistent is it. Onshore and offshore wind farms have a term called the capacity factor, and it's a fraction, less than 1, but it defines, essentially how many hours per year is the wind resource strong enough to generate that. And so that's a capacity factor, something good to look at on each of these projects. But back from a conversation with the environmental community, they said, as long as it's over the horizon, we can't see it from the beach, it's a clean form of energy which we like to support. And also we feel like if the wind turbines go out there, they're never going to come drill for oil and gas off the East Coast. And so that's a relevant point. I could speak to it from a personal conversation with Boone Pickens, who's a large independent oil and gas developer. I had an opportunity to ask him about the East Coast U.S. And he said that this was some years ago, but he said in his experience looking at the geology offshore, he did not think that there was sufficient oil and gas resources out there to attract the investment. So take that from someone who probably had a lot better look at the data than most of us. But the other thing, just in closing, because we come from a strong background with the oil and gas industry, I've talked with and I've watched what is happening with those companies. And I think it's important for Virginia to notice that companies such as DOM, the Danish offshore oil and gas group, has changed their name to Ørsted, and they are pulling away from fossil fuels in general. Total, not Total, but Statoil, also the Norwegian oil, national oil company, has a strong interest in U.S. East Coast wind. And we've also seen Shell show interest and participate, not so much as a developer, but as an investor. So I think it'll be of interest for the Virginia persons and groups responsible for this to maintain a dialogue with the oil and gas industry, because they have tremendous offshore operations experience, the supply chain, the logistics and all that have been mentioned here. Is something that began in the Gulf of Mexico. It migrated to the North Sea in the 1970s, and now the Europeans are 20 years ahead of us in terms of their offshore experience. So I think Virginia would do well to keep the dialogue going with all of those parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for the good comments. And I'd just like to elaborate on the importance of what Charles said. I mean, first of all, you briefly introduced your company. It's well known Waldemar Nelson's ideas are actually talked about in the offshore wind industry. You know, those concepts. So it's not just the stable, well-proven oil and gas business, but it's also the innovation and the new ideas to support offshore wind. But the key point I would like to make, thank you so much for being here and being engaged since with this process. Oil and gas US is an absolute key success factor. We always talk about the European learning curve. We've seen the obvious reason with the, all those gigawatts installed, but equally important is the oil and gas experience. The US is leading worldwide in oil and gas, with some other countries like Norway and others also being very strong, but there's a solid offshore capability. And when we talk offshore wind, of course, it's an energy element, which really an area I know well. I've been in energy for 25 years, but it's more than its energy production, it's more about offshore conditions. That is the main challenge, to make this safe, cost-efficient, predictable, secure. Those wind turbines, they work, but it's the environment they're in is a challenge, and that's where we really welcome the support and advice, and also operational involvement. So I really would see, I would see Virginia becoming a leading player, supported by a European learning curve in the first few years. After that will no longer be necessary, and then heavily supported by the oil and gas industry, probably, moving their focus in addition to the Gulf of Mexico to the East Coast to support offshore wind.